that's the cost. And if you think about it, people are going to look back at us, they're going to really laugh. Because the idea that you would take a home or a building that has a perfectly good roof on it, and then you would drill holes in the roof and put little posts in and put another roof that by definition leaks because it's a bunch of panels on your roof, is going to look totally stupid. People are going to say, I can't believe you walked around with, this boombox on your shoulder. If you watch, a Spike Lee movie, and then you walked around with a cell phone the size of, a briefcase, and then you did this to your roof, right? The natural product is not only the roofing shingles are themselves solar cells, which already are starting to exist. But I just came back from visiting a company in France, and they're making 97% transparent solar panels. How transparent is glass? 92. So it is more transparent than glass. And then you talk about office buildings that themselves are not just trying to use the roof area, but the actual walls of the building are solar panels as well. Now you start to get the products that make a lot of sense. And so just to go back to Andy's point at the beginning, we've had this wonderful history of this group playing big leadership roles. Cyrus's a Ph.D. here was something that was joint between myself and Paul, who is now director of LVL. And it was funny because he walked in and I said he wants to work on a solar product that totally didn't fit any of the patterns. And so we spent about 6 months figuring out what that would be. And he says, well, I want to think about solar cells that are not racing towards high efficiency. I only care about the cost of installed final systems. So what he did for his thesis was an analysis that looked at lots of different materials, not based on how efficient they were solar cells, but on how cheap the materials was to get and our best guess of what their band gap was going to be. And so did this big analysis, looked at mining costs, all kinds of non-solar things. The winning technology or the winning material came out to be pyrite. Fool's gold was the most attractive combination of all those things. Now it's a low efficiency solar cell, but it has generated, Paul, we just talked about this, it's generated more calls to Paul's lab, and that's where he did the deposition of pyrite, than anything he's done since. And of all the nano products, this is the one that hasn't generated a big company. There is no Solar City pyrite. I think fools anything doesn't sound good. But it's an interesting process, and again, that's where part of this club's beginning happened. So you've talked about, and everyone is sort of sick of the learning curves and thinking about where we're going, but it is still worth putting this in perspective because one of the things that comes out of the comments you just heard is that if we're right now in a phase where we have just seen this huge drop in prices. We've seen a number of the big companies that looked like they had no chance to die, now in real trouble. Yinglis and Suntex and all in real trouble. The question is, are we going to, in the next phase, maintain enough interesting innovative companies so that this kind of progression of individual innovations, no one of which was a revolution or a home run, but all of which went into pushing the learning curve down until we got to the point where suddenly large-scale manufacturing in Asia blew us off and below the learning curve. What we don't want to happen is that we relax back to the learning curve or go above it because the number of innovators has been dropped down. And so all of the comments you heard about how to figure out new opportunities, to build new business models, I think is really critical. And so the paper Andy and I highlighted, we looked at the learning curves, not only in terms of the overall crystalline ones with, again, this drop that we've seen that's even further down below now, but also the kind of slower and steadier progress that thin film. This is just data for solar. An interesting story in itself, just how First Solar was financed, have contributed to this overall kind of picture. And so something that you guys are going to have to do, assuming that the next CEOs and the next ARPA, DARPA leaders are in this room, is you guys are going to have to do something that none of us did in my generation. And that is not just think about, well, what did it take in terms of the Walmart family investment here or scaling up manufacturing here. You're going to have to think about the world very differently. So here's one of the figures from the paper that shows the ramp up of course, historic and a little bit of near-term forecast for what we think is going to be going on in the PV installation industry in the United States, China, Germany, and Japan, which, although those four are something like 45% of total installation. And so it's not everything, but it's a big chunk of the story. And if you kind of look at this in terms of what's evolved in each country, these little polar plots highlight the percentage of the share of each country along three axes: market share, manufacturing, and then patenting, one measure of innovation. And US has been a big player in the patenting innovation side, much smaller up until now on deployment, but the prospects in some ways in the US are really high, given everything that's changed here. China essentially came out of nowhere in this regard. I mean, not a player at all, 2000, and just dramatic ramp up, obviously number one in manufacturing today. Germany, well, Japan, that was the early leader. When no one else was interested, Japan really did everything. They carried all of our water in terms of manufacturing, investment in deployment, and R&D. The Japanese economy got tired, not so much the solar investors. Germany came along, and the prospects are now that Germany will really retrench. But when I say you guys have to do something much more interesting and complicated than we did, is you're going to have to work in a space where you're drawing on strengths not only of different companies and research labs, but working much more internationally than any of us did. Because to take advantage of all of these features, you're going to have to be as comfortable speaking German as Mandarin and English, and thinking in terms of the business models and the ways things work, and how the universities are changing in all these countries. And again, that's a big change over the kinds of things that we have done. One interesting feature that we didn't highlight here, and that is that off-grid, I don't want to do that one, I want to do this one, and that off-grid technologies are really changing. So poorest, newest country on the planet, South Sudan. When you land in the airport, the first person that met us last time was someone selling charcoal. Here I am with my guard slash guide with his AK-47. And this is the store where I went to buy lunch, right? So there's their power supply. And so thinking about this hugely interesting and new growing market is a place where Berkeley and MIT and Carnegie Mellon, a few places are doing a lot in terms of off-grid, small-scale products. What are we doing about mini-grids, micro-grids, nano-grids? How do you build up those markets so the business models there are as interesting and as sophisticated, and not just kind of a poor hand-me-down of what's going on in California or Germany or Japan. That's a challenge that we all talk about, and you can take lots of development classes on this campus. This building is all about that, but we really are at the total infancy. And to make solar, these technologies go, you're going to have to think of these markets as interesting, as sexy, as important, as deserving of detailed work, as dealing with the California market, where we can show you graph after graph showing the incredibly detailed picture of California with a 1 million solar roof mandate, and then a 3 gigawatt distributed PV mandate, and what fraction of the RPS. And this is where most of the attention goes. You guys are the first generation of students that look at the walls of this room, think, I don't want to say as hard yet, because I still don't think you guys work as hard on these off-grid distributed markets as the on-grid ones. But they are as important, and the opportunities are bigger, and so figuring out ways to make this happen is really dramatic. And so one useful lesson from the California story is that when California first started to invest in energy efficiency back in the late 70s, early 80s, people said efficiency is not important, and if it is important, it is going to be a lot of expensive hardware that may or may not pay off. Well, California, as everyone who takes a course at Berkeley knows, has made efficiency just a huge success story. Same thing in Denmark and elsewhere. And so hopefully everyone has seen the famous Rosenfeld graph. And if you don't have it tattooed somewhere, I'll be your cool ink person you should have the tattoo somewhere on your body. But the fact that we decoupled energy consumption and GDP, forgetting what a few cranky economists at Stanford say about, what fraction of the decoupling is due to this or that, that's a huge success story. And everyone in the 70s said that couldn't happen. So once we got past the feature that, if you want to invest heavily in efficiency, even if you make it work, it won't pay off. Now it's paid off. Come up to the 90s, the same exact story with solar. People said, it's great for some rural applications, and there'll be some places like California that install a bunch of it, but it can't take off and make this huge change, right? And then when it was proven that you can do it, then the next thing was, if you do that, it's too expensive, it'll bankrupt the economy, right? So same exact progression of thought in solar that's in efficiency. And so where are we today? Right. Solar One went on and is now largely built in Ivanpah in the desert, and so it's up and running. It's selling power into the grid, and there are all these questions. Ivanpah had to move to a new location because of ecological issues. It's not an ideal location. It's too near Nevada, too far from the demand centers of LA, but it's up and running, and there's lots of interesting projects that are coming out of it. And now there are people saying, oh, we don't want to do solar thermal because PV is much cheaper, it's easier to put on rooftops. Well, I have news for you. We're going to need both. We're going to need both because one of the big challenges coming is that as we scale up to large amounts of renewables, weather and other features that change during the day are going to be a bigger and bigger story. There's a whole new story, just like I just said for efficiency, just like I said for solar, coming in the area of storage. One of the challenges of storage today, though, is that almost every company working in storage is thinking about technologies that can give you 6 hours, 8 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours of storage. That doesn't mean, the students that come after you won't be doing storage that can last for a week. But that's not on the radar screen yet. Because it takes a while, as you just heard, to bring these companies into existence. One of the challenges is California, for example, has long periods of time during the summer when there's not a lot of wind. That means even if your storage is cheap, Gesundheit, even if storage is cheap, if there's no renewable energy to put into the storage, it doesn't matter much. So to use huge amounts of wind could require storage technologies we haven't even started on. Whereas the storage technologies that we have already started on are ones that fit really well with solar. Because solar, you get to replenish that supply every day, whereas there can be times in July, August, September in the West where wind can be low for a week or two at a time. So one thing that this technology has is built-in solar, built-in storage. 6 hours of storage built in, power gets generated from the collection site and then goes in. And so we've got this kind of technology. So I would not recommend saying the future of solar is PV. I would say it's PV plus solar thermal plus storage. And so right now in California, where people said, you can't do efficiency, if you can do it, it's too expensive, you can't do solar, it's too expensive. Now what we're seeing is the world's biggest solar thermal arrays in California, the world's biggest thin film arrays in California. Oh, and by the way, the world's biggest wind farm is in California. Oh, and by the way, the biggest solar neighborhoods in the world are now in California, and the biggest manufacturing in the state now suddenly is electric vehicles. None of these things were predicted by anyone my age or older. We are dead wrong on all this. People said, you can't manufacture cars in the United States, and you certainly can't manufacture them in high-cost California. Well, guess what? And so in terms of trying to put all of this in context, I wouldn't listen to anyone over 30 or 40 or 50. But I also wouldn't listen to business models that you guys haven't kicked the tires on. Because to make our challenges like, we have to have net energy zero homes by 2020. We know how to do that, but it's tricky. We have to have net zero office buildings by 2030. We have no idea how to do that. All of these things are going to require business models that don't exist today. And so let me stop there.
So this is our token.
Oh, thank you.
There is a solar charger.
Oh.